Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Victoria. I'm from SECUDE, and I will be your moderator for the event. At the top of your screen, you will find a Q&A button. Please type your questions in the box, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session, time permitting. Any questions that do not get answered today will be answered by email. And this webinar will be recorded. It is recording now, and all attendees will be emailed a copy of the slide deck and the recording. Today, we will be talking about data classification and how to close the gap between enterprise and SAP data. Onto the agenda. Keith. Today, we'll be talking about, we'll first get a quick background on both SECUDE and Boldon James. Then Keith will be speaking about the role of data classification and the user experience. Then he'll hand it over to Michael for classification in SAP data. Next slide. So about Michael Coomer, he's the President Americas at SECUDE. And SECUDE is a global provider of data protection solutions for SAP customers. We are the original developers of SAP Single Sign-On and now focus on data-centric security and classification solutions for SAP. And from Boldon James, we have Product Director Keith Vallant speaking. And I'll hand it over to you, Keith, for a little background on Boldon James before jumping into the webinar.
Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everyone. So Boldon James is a software company, and we specialize in products for data classification and also secure messaging. And we've been building our expertise now for over 30 years and also have the security as a business of being part of an organization which is a $2 billion organization in Kinetic PLC. We have customers for our products around the globe, and we support those through offices in key regions, plus we have a worldwide partner network. So that's enough about us. Let's take a look first at the rationale for data classification, and perhaps just as important, how to make it fit your business. So thinking about the drivers for data classification itself, this list is drawn up from our own experience with our customers, and also the market analysts that we work with. So not necessarily in the strongest order, but I think all are important, and maybe the mix is different for different organizations, but let's just run through them. So the first one we have here, improving data security awareness. Well, classification is as much about people as it is about applications and processes. So really for a lot of our customers, raising security awareness through classification with users is very important. And obviously enforcing your own corporate security policy. Well, with a lot of customers, when we start out a program with them, we find they have a classification policy, but it's probably gathering dust effectively in the business if it isn't really being enforced and the knowledge isn't out there amongst the users. Obviously, a critical one really for classification is to help you identify your key information, your sensitive information. And if you don't know where that data is, you can't possibly control it. So that's a key step. I guess a number of you will be in regulated industries, so as part of your compliance, certainly to industry regulations, classification can help you demonstrate not only best practice, but also compliance with guidelines such as ISO 27001 and other industry-specific regulations. An interesting one for a lot of organizations is working with the data loss prevention measures you may have in place. So classification can help you improve the effectiveness of a lot of DLP solutions. And those of you who know those technologies know they can be notorious for rather frustrating false positives that the users get very annoyed about, and rightly so. And you can help tone that with classification to get the balance right between engaging the users and obviously protecting your data. Securing the mobile and remote access. I think most enterprises now, the workforce is pretty mobile and highly distributed, more so than ever before, with very permeable boundaries in the organization. So classification can be fundamental to ensuring you've got control really at a data level, rather than trying to worry about protecting at ever-decreasing network boundaries. And on the collaboration point, I think we find most modern businesses now need to be highly collaborative with both their partners and their customers. There's high level engagement. And without classification, respecting and protecting the intellectual property and the personal information of others is a complete minefield. So it becomes a fundamental building block for that. So if we just consider the vast quantities of unstructured data in a business, then these are some of the steps you can take to get control over that data and protect what's most sensitive to you as a business. So the key first one is obviously to identify what is sensitive amongst all the data that you have, and to build out a scheme for identifying that consistently over its life cycle. Discovery, well, obviously that data is already out there, and you need to work out where it is and how to access it as part of that process. And that could be done through discovery solutions or through a more manual exercise, but there will be that discovery activity at some point in this kind of process. And obviously the stage we're most interested in is classifying that data once you've identified it, found out where it is, and also where it's been created from. And we're going to be talking more about points of creation of that data later on. Once you've got it classified, then you've got a fighting chance really of applying the right security measures and protective measures for that data then throughout the rest of its life cycle. And not forgetting the need to keep an eye on what's happening in the business. So once you've got this information classified, hopefully secured, applying some metrics, not only to your processes, but your users as well, to work out how well things are going and how people are performing with the classified data that you've got in the business. So if we just consider a typical data life cycle, then I know people sometimes measure these or describe them in different ways, but we're using these phases of data creation and storage through to use, sharing, archiving, and then finally data destruction. We consider that particular wheel. Then essentially the vital step is to classify at the earliest possible stage. Not to say that that is the only place you can do it at the point of creation. You can do it later. But the earlier you do that, the greater the chance really is of capturing the right context for that information and applying the right controls at the earliest possible moment. So we flagged up right at the top here that that data is primarily being generated by end user activity. And that isn't being plucked out of thin air, of course. A lot of that data will come from existing sources that the users have access to. And one of the ones we're going to talk about today is that data coming from a structured data source, such as SAP, which is where SECUDE's Halo Core solution comes into play, where that data is being pulled into the unstructured world and the need then to protect and control it. In the full life cycle, really, it's the metadata, the classification adds to the information that becomes the means by which you can apply all the controls throughout the life cycle of that data. So that becomes the secret sauce, really, to help you orchestrate all those various technologies. So we just think about the dimensions then of a data classification solution. In our terminology anyway, this starts with a classification policy. And really that includes fundamentally the schema that you've come up with to identify your information. And that could be as simple as just a hierarchy of value to the business, or could be quite a complex scheme with a lot of different elements. It's whatever suits the business. And then bound up into that scheme is how you're going to mark the information that you're dealing with. And we think about that in two different ways. First is visually, so things that user will see in the content of the information, be it a Word document, let's say, or a spreadsheet. How are you going to mark that information so it's clear to people what its value is to the business? And then there's the hidden information, the metadata, that secret source. How are you going to structure and add that to various different document types and files that your users are dealing with? And what binds all that together then is a set of handling rules. And really this is to do with how users can actually both apply classification and what they're allowed to do with the classification once it's applied. So will you let people change those labels? Will there be certain controls you want to apply about, let's say, the distribution or the dissemination of classified material? All of those handling rules that relate to classification are part of that policy. So if the user is important to the mix, then where is it best to actually engage them in the process of classification? Well, where we focus is on their primary productivity tools, where we see that they will create and manipulate information and also share and collaborate with that information. So our classifier products extend the environments shown up here to support the users in working with all kinds of classified material. So be that within the Office application set, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Visio project, those sorts of applications, as well as extremes perhaps, such as engineering applications, CAD applications, where users are working with highly sensitive intellectual property on behalf of the business. Equally, they need to be aware of and engage with classification. And then the points where we collaborate and share. So that might be through email systems, like through Outlook and Notes, as well as collaborative systems such as SharePoint, and obviously the mobile environments as well. So is classification all about users? Well, we'd say not. Our approach is to blend together mixtures of automated and manual classification techniques. So for the manual, yes, the user's involved, but there are techniques where you want to involve system-led decisions in the process of classification. So our little wheel here is really designed to illustrate the different ways in which we can engage classification within the business. So on the top left there, we're really focusing on getting user insight into applying classification decisions. And then moving round the wheel towards the top right, here we're aiding the user in the process by adding a little bit of system knowledge and understanding to help them to classify the material they're working with. So not leaving it entirely to them, but helping them through the process of recommending classifications. And then moving down towards the lower right-hand side, we can also support fully automated classification techniques. So the user is not necessarily involved at all here. And we'll be talking a little bit later about the Halo Core solution and how that can actually work to classify material automatically that's being extracted from SAP systems. That's a good example of that particular segment. And then on the lower left, we have another technique which really adds to all of the others. And this is making sure that the user, maybe not all users, have the ability to endorse classification decisions of others or of the system. So putting the user in the driving seat for certain pre-classified information. So that's probably enough of the theory. Let's take a look at the user experience of classification. So I'll draw a few examples here from our classifier products, starting with some of the Microsoft Office applications. So hopefully it's familiar ground for everyone. So this is just a little example of our application working within Microsoft Word. So we're essentially an add-in here to the Word application. And the presence of a classifier itself is a really light touch within the host application. So yes, there's a presence there up on the ribbon bar to help the user classify material or see what the classification is. But here we're also showing the application of some of those visual markings I was talking about earlier. So here there's some information being added into the header of the document to clearly mark this as internal. And we can apply colors and logos and icons both in the user interface and in those markings so that users can have a really sort of consistent experience of all the different ways you might want to represent classification or reinforce it to them. Colors, graphics, text, all can be made consistent and really tailored to each organization as well. So thinking about those dimensions again, this is the metadata dimension here we're thinking about. So here again, we've selected a slightly different classification, and it's an email this time that we're classifying. So that's an Outlook screenshot. And what's showing there on the bottom right-hand side is a snippet from the metadata for that email, which is where we're placing the metadata tag, the representation of that classification that will be carried with the email. And at the bottom of the application, what we're showing there is an interpretation for the user of what's in that metadata marking. So it doesn't matter if he's navigating around the different tabs of the Office application, he's still got that constant visual reminder of what the sensitivity is of this data. So this can be the scary slide, and this is really just to remind people, I suppose, that classification can get complicated if you want it to. And it can be as simple as a hierarchy of value to the business, or, as in this example, and this is drawn from a customer who's working in the export control area and has to comply with ITAR regulations. This is a scheme that they use to reflect those requirements. So it's quite a complex environment. But it doesn't have to be, and obviously you need a solution that can smoothly transition from the very simple to the very complex, to meet whatever the classification needs are of your business. And that third element of the dimensions of data classification that we were talking about is providing the rules and the control around what people could do classified material. So this is a little example based again on Outlook. Showing here someone composing an email. They've labeled it as confidential, and they've added a couple of recipients, and one of whom they've used the address picker and actually got the wrong address in here. So based on that, we can apply checks to say this is actually an inappropriate recipient to receive information classified at this level. So we can put in a speed bump or a block if it's required, to actually prevent that email going out to the wrong person. So in this case, we're showing it as a prevention, so the user has to fix the problem. And we give them a couple of ways of doing that through simple quick fix remediation buttons and guidance on screen as well. So if they want to understand why they've been stopped from doing this, they can have some tailored information to help guide them as to what went wrong. Finally, it's important really to consider that it is not just Microsoft Office applications where sensitive data is being manipulated. So as I mentioned on the summary slide earlier, we can extend to other applications such as CAD applications, where again we're bringing the same kind of user experience for classification as a user will have if he's transitioning into the Office application. So he hasn't got to think differently about the world of classification. If he's in this particular app, then he's going to see the same kind of interface presented in the same way with the same rules and checks and balances applied. So hopefully that's given you a little flavor of the world of classification, particularly from the user perspective. Michael is going to take us through the SAP dimension of classification and really link the two stories together for us. So, Michael, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
All right, thank you, Keith. Yeah, I grabbed the screen. So thanks very much for your introduction to the basics of data classification and for showing us how Boldon James classifier can be used to classify data at the time of creation outside of SAP. Now let's see how we can bring that functionality into SAP using SECUDE's Halo Core solution for the purpose of classifying data at the time of extraction from SAP. And then we'll see how we can cross-integrate both solutions for a very seamless end-user experience. As an SAP customer, you run your business on SAP, and chances are there is a lot of business-critical information stored inside of SAP. Depending on the industry you're in, the applications and modules you have deployed, that could be anything from product specifications, personnel, vendor, customer information, analytical data, financial information, etc. And SAP provides you with a number of tools to secure the data while stored inside of SAP. But unfortunately, the data doesn't stay there because it is extracted and downloaded by your end users on a regular basis for the purpose of collaboration, sharing, number crunching, etc. So let's look at how SAP data moves about the organization. On top here, we have your data center with your SAP and non-SAP applications. And you can see already that there is data in transit, not only between SAP applications, but also between SAP and non-SAP applications. But you put controls around the data center to make sure Nobody unauthorized can get in. You have physical security. You pretty much do everything to make sure that data remains secure while inside of the data center. But as I've mentioned, the data doesn't stay there. It gets converted into so-called corporate unstructured data, and that's your everyday spreadsheet, PDF, Word documents, whatever it may be. A lot of that stuff comes out of the data center, and now you have to put in another set of controls to properly classify and protect the data as it moves about the organization. And Gartner actually says that 2/3 of all corporate data lives outside the data center. So by only protecting the data center, you only really protect a small fraction of your overall data. And it doesn't stop there. According to Checkpoint, on average, sensitive data is sent outside the organization every 49 minutes. So it becomes incredibly important to intercept, audit, classify, and if necessary, protect data at the time of creation in a way that's persistent so that the classification and protection sticks with the data no matter where it goes and no matter how the data is created. So at this point, I typically ask, how much data do you think your users extract from SAP on a regular basis? And because SAP doesn't really have the tools to give you an easy answer to that, we've done a case study with one of our Austrian manufacturing customers. Typically, I ask that question, but since you can't answer, I'm answering it for you. But that Austrian customer had a relatively small SAP footprint of about 3,000 SAP users on an ECC6 system with mostly finance, human resources, and controlling data. And we've put in HaloCore, not for the purpose of auditing anything, not for the purpose of classifying anything yet, but just for giving the customer transparency into how much data is taken out of SAP. And during those 30 days, HaloCore was running to monitor data extractions. We logged 100,000 downloads. Now that's quite a big number given the relative small size of the SAP landscape. Imagine if you have 20,000, 40,000, 50,000 SAP users instead of 3,000. And imagine if you have 50 instances instead of 3. How much data is extracted on a regular basis from SAP by your end users without you even knowing and without you having the ability to intercept, audit, and classify that data. But of course, SAP does give you tools to protect data, and one of the more powerful tools is roles and authorizations, with which you can, on a very granular basis, define who can access what in SAP. You may even put in GRC to manage segregation of duties and emergency access. Of course, you patch your SAP servers to make sure they're up to date and don't have any vulnerabilities. You may even enable secure network communications to encrypt RFC traffic so that data is secure in transit. You may do password management, single sign-on. You may encrypt the whole database or scan code of custom applications for potential vulnerabilities. But all of that is really meant to protect the data while it's stored inside of SAP. When the data is extracted, all of those tools become somewhat obsolete because they are not extended to the data leaving SAP. And then it's really up to your enterprise security to take care of the data. So again, you may have your firewalls, your enterprise data classification like Boldon James classifier, DLP, rights management, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that there is a distinctive gap between SAP security and enterprise security, both organizationally and from a technology perspective. Because inside of SAP, there is very rich context that determines who can see and do what. And all of that is lost. And so your enterprise security solutions have a hard time in figuring out where that data came from within SAP and what the data exactly means. And that's where HaloCore comes in, to bridge that gap between SAP and enterprise security. HaloCore sits on top of SAP, so it has access to a lot of context that can be used for automated data classification, and it can enrich that data with metadata so that a Boldon James classifier can pick up that metadata and make an automatic or carry forward that classification that was determined by HaloCore before the data has left SAP. And we're going to look at how that exactly works and what that means over the next few slides. So let's look at an example. I'm an SAP HR user and I have access to an HR report. And typically, the way it works in SAP, if I can see something, then I can extract it or download it. So if I look at an HR report, I can just right-click and say, export to spreadsheet. And if I do that, once the data has left SAP, then all those controls that protected that report, the roles and authorizations, they become obsolete because they don't travel with the data. There is also no easy way of keeping track of that export activity. I cannot do the classification at the time of creation or extraction. And there are a number of other things that you simply lose by taking data out of the secure boundaries of SAP. So again, it's up then to the enterprise security solutions like Boldon James Classifier to look at the data and either work with the end user or inspect the content and try to figure out how to best classify that data. And Boldon James Classifier does an excellent job of doing that for data created outside of SAP. But with the help of HaloCore, it can do an even better job. Because HaloCore has access to contextual attributes. And what I mean by that is, for instance, an application component that immediately tells you if the data is HR, FI, MM, PP, or whatever it may be. It tells you exactly who the user is within SAP, what roles and authorizations that user has, because it makes a difference from a classification perspective. If that user looking at that HR report can only see name, title, and phone number, or if that person can also see pay information and social security numbers. HaloCore can tell you what transaction code the data came from, what table within the T code that data came from. That's especially important for certain data browsing transactions like SE16 or SQL 01. And it can tell you what device the information is downloaded to, among many other things. So by adding metadata information that corresponds to the determined classification or simply to some of those attributes, Boldon James Classifier can pick those up and properly control the data once it has left the secure boundaries of SAP. So going back to our example, with HaloCore, we intercept the extraction before that file is written to the user's computer or to cloud storage or whatever it may be. We look at the context and automatically classify the data. We audit all those data extractions, and we add metadata to help downstream solutions do a better job of handling the data outside of SAP. So from a Boldon James SECUDE perspective, this is how it looks. HaloCore does the interception, does the analysis of context, does the classification, applies the metadata, and using that metadata, Classifier can add those visual markings we've seen before and we're going to see again in a couple of slides to show the user how this data was classified. And it can take care of onward control, and we're going to see an example of that as well. So let's look at that. Again, I'm an SAP HR user. I have access to this flexible employee data report containing certain personally identifiable information, perhaps pay information, nationality, number of children, stuff that you don't want to get out. And because I can see this report, I can just right-click and I can say export to spreadsheet. And then I pick my export format, Excel being the most common one. I pick my storage location, and when I click Save, before this file is written to disk, HaloCore has already intercepted it, and in this particular case, shows the user a classification UI. Now this UI is optional. You don't have to show that to the end user. You can do everything in the background completely transparently, or you can show it to the user, but not give the user the ability to make any changes. Or like in this case, and all of that, by the way, is driven by roles and authorizations, going back to that. In this case, the user has full control. So I, as the user, could say, well, this does not apply to the US, but really to all the regions. And then I could confirm it. I could confirm it as is. I could save it unclassified if I wanted to, or if I can simply cancel out of the extraction. But in this case, I simply say confirm. I'm okay with what HaloCore determined in terms of classification. And then let's jump real quick to what's happening on the back end with the audit log. So here we can see that very same download. We can see the time, username, transaction code, web done per application if applicable, the table names, if a UI was involved in the download and the classification, if the download was aborted, if it was blocked, because we can also block based on certain classification, where the file was written to, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, we can see the classification. And we see a system-derived and user-defined classification. And what that means is that the first column, or the middle one in this case, shows what HaloCore thought how the data should be classified. And then the last one shows what the user finally chose. And in this case, they are the same because the user simply confirmed what HaloCore correctly classified as internal-only HRUS. But if it was different, then you would see the difference here. And then you could send an alert via email or through SAP's access control to make someone aware that a user, for instance, reclassified something internal only as public. But then switching back to the front end, the Excel report gets downloaded, Excel opens up, and you can immediately see the visual markings that Boldon James's classifier applied based on the metadata that SECUDE's HaloCore put into the file. So you can see in the ribbon, it's an internal document. On the bottom, you can see internal human resources, US only. And then very similar to what you can do in SAP, also outside of SAP, you can control what an end user can do. For instance, can the end user change the classification? Well, in this case, no. If the user tried to change internal to confidential, then classifier would tell the user, sorry, but you cannot do that. All you can do is restore the original classification or back out of it. A second example in terms of onward control is drafting an email. So in this case, I'm drafting an email to John, who is part of my company and clearly part of my email domain. But I also have Nancy@yahoo.com on the recipients list, and she is clearly not part of the organization, or at least not part of the email domain. And then I decide to attach that very report I just downloaded from SAP. And you can here see as well the overlay icon indicating that this is an internally classified document. And as soon as I attach this report, the email itself gets classified based on the classification of the attachment. And so if I click send now, classifier again comes in and says, hey, you're trying to send something internal or something that was classified as internal only to an unapproved recipient, namely Nancy@yahoo.com. But based on this configuration now, it's only a warning and a recommendation for the user to remove that recipient, while at the same time allowing the user to move forward. So you don't always want to be in the way of the user. Sometimes it's enough to simply make the user aware and properly audit and log everything so you can react to that later if need be. So to sum it up, with HaloCore and classifier, it doesn't really matter where the data gets created. If it's created outside of SAP, then classifier picks up the context right there in your productivity tools and handles everything. If data is created or extracted from SAP, then HaloCore can do the classification based on context, apply metadata that then classifier picks up. And that's important because it ultimately leads to a very cohesive end user experience. So from an end user experience, it doesn't really make a difference where the data came from and how it was created. It's a consistent handling of your data, of all of your enterprise data. And that effectively makes you or helps you to make better data classification decisions and to better control your data. And that leads to an increased level of compliance and to lower costs. And additionally, those metadata tags, no matter if applied by HaloCore or by classifier, can be picked up by third parties, like a data loss prevention solution or an e-discovery or archiving solutions, to make data handling decisions without them having to reanalyze and re-inspect the content. And by using those visual markings and by involving the end user, you can increase user awareness and accountability, all for the purpose of keeping your data secure. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Victoria again to have our questions and answers session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Our Q&A session is now open. Please remember to send any questions you have through the Q&A box at the top of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can. Okay, our first question I have here is, do large businesses only deploy classification solutions in certain departments?
Yeah, Victoria, let me take that one. So this is an interesting one because I think before I actually came into the world of classification, I would have almost predicted it to be a departmental level solution. But what certainly I found and what we find in the market generally is that most businesses looking to deploy a classification solution do it at an enterprise level. They do it enterprise-wide. I think when you sort of drill down into the thought process, that's really because it doesn't make a lot of sense to just deal with an island in the business and apply classification or a software solution to that one environment, because information is flowing from that department across boundaries and throughout the rest of the organization. So if you do not do it enterprise-wide, then you're really missing the point or missing the value of the data classification solution. So in almost all cases, our customers are deploying these solutions on an enterprise level. And these are organizations with many tens of thousands of end users. So you might think that that's no kind of mean undertaking. But nonetheless, that I think is an indication of the level of importance that they attach to classification, that they tackle it this way. So yeah, in simple answer then, nope, this is really an enterprise-wide solution, not a departmental one.
Okay, good. Another question we have here: has anyone actually measured the impact of classification on the security awareness of a workforce?
Yeah, metrics are always interesting. We have one particular customer who is an insurance business, and one of the reasons they came to data classification is primarily because of the security awareness question. This is user awareness of data security. And they used to conduct routine internal audit of security awareness. So they would survey the end users and do various other things to check compliance. And they were routinely missing their audit targets. So they deployed the classification solution and measured the before and after effect, which is always the interesting one. And what they saw was actually a 60% improvement in the security awareness of their end users, just the thought processes the users were going through. And that extended to even correctly handling printed material that they'd obviously classified, they printed out on a printer, and because it had visual markings on it, they were putting that away in the desk drawers, they were locking the desk drawers, and they were asking the security department for more lockable file storage as well, which is probably a reaction they hadn't actually anticipated. And they also, I believe, got a really dramatic reduction in what they measured as security policy breaches, something around 89%, which is phenomenal, I think. And after their initial pilot of the data classification solution within the business, they obviously withdrew it from the original proof of concept, and they had users asking if they could have it back again. So probably not a reaction they would have predicted, but I think that was a measure of how useful the end users had actually found it. So quite clearly not intrusive, but very supportive as far as those end users were concerned.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question here. How does the technical part of the integration look?
Okay, and Keith, I can take that if you don't mind. So it's actually fairly simple. So those two solutions don't necessarily have to really talk to each other. It's really all about that metadata that is applied by HaloCore at the time of extraction from SAP, and reading that metadata by Boldon James classifier. So we just put the metadata in places where classifier would expect that metadata to be, and where classifier itself puts that metadata if we talk about data created outside of SAP. So we simply use a common storage location of metadata to make both solutions look as if they were tightly integrated. So from an implementation perspective, it's fairly simple. You just set up both and you agree on the metadata, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, sounds good. So last call for any more questions. Just type them into your Q&A box on the top or side of your screen. Okay, we have one more. How does a classification solution benefit data loss prevention?
Okay, let me take that one. The real sort of benefit here, I think, probably is obvious to those who've actually used data loss prevention solutions, DLP solutions. And a lot of those solutions really focus on doing work behind the scenes and not engaging an end user in the task. So they're really working in the background, trying to identify information that may well be sensitive, and then to apply controls. And obviously the reaction to those controls is occasionally you get in the way of the user. Suddenly something will pop up and require him to make a decision, or basically tell him that he can't do something that he actually wants to do. But that may be the first time really that the user is aware of the fact that there is an issue to do with the value of the information or what he's trying to do with it. And of course, in tuning those sort of systems, it can be very, very difficult to get the rules set right. So you get this balance between actually protecting, identifying the information concern, protecting it, and engaging the users. Getting that kind of balance right with those rules is incredibly difficult and can be a very ongoing process in a lot of businesses that have DLP solutions, constantly tuning and reacting to what's happening out there in the business. So really, it's all about addressing that issue of the error rate, let's call it the false positive rate that you see in those DLP solutions. If you're using the classification of the material, of emails and of documents as part of your DLP decision making, and the users have been involved in that process of classification, then you've got a more joined up DLP approach, and that's really where we see the benefits. So helping the business really to get the best out of their DLP solution and improve its efficiency, and as far as the end users are concerned, improve its accuracy and their understanding as to what is going on. So they're no longer just regarded as part of the problem. They're actually part of the data loss prevention solution, and that's a far more engaged and aware workforce if you can accomplish that. So that's really how the sort of benefits derived.
Okay, that's good. And I have one more question here. What other IT tools do you have on the radar? For example, BI tools, big data tools, database tools, etc.
Good question. Yeah, so HaloCore currently supports, if we talk about SAP solutions, that is, so HaloCore supports pretty much all SAP solutions from NetWeaver ABAP to BOBI. We're currently working on Fiori. It supports HANA as a database below. In fact, we're database agnostic, so it doesn't really matter what the database is. And you can extract our logs into whatever data analysis tool you may have. So any HANA-powered BI, you can take that audit log out of our logs and analyze it and dashboard it, and from a non-SAP perspective, if you're interested in what can you do with HaloCore non-SAP systems, then we have an API or an interface that you can use to make calls into HaloCore for the same purpose of auditing, classifying, and protecting your information on non-SAP systems as well. And we can go into, we can certainly pick up that question offline and go into more details on what that exactly means.
Okay, thank you. One more, can applications be classified?
What was that? Can applications be classified?
Yes.
Okay. I might have to guess the dimension for this one, but we don't really have a concept of classifying the applications per se. What we can do is we can vary classification policy depending on the application. So that really gives you an opportunity to fine-tune the user experience of classification depending on what the application is they're working within. So you may well, for very obvious reasons, want to have a slightly different policy when you're actually working within sharing or collaborative application. Let's say there might be SharePoint, or it could be within Outlook for email, as opposed to working with documents or spreadsheets. So you can make that kind of application discrimination. But we don't actually classify the applications per se, but they are nonetheless, I suppose, the identity of the application is part of the policy mix of the rules we're applying. I hope that helps.
Okay, looks like that's all the questions we have today. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you all for attending. Remember, you will soon be receiving a copy of the slides and the recorded presentation. And if you have any more questions, you can just respond to those emails and we'll get back to you.